My husband betrayed me in the worst possible way. I already forged the documents. All her money will be mine, and I'll leave her out on the street for being stupid, he told his best friend. But the scoundrel overlooked a small detail, and in that moment, my revenge began. Marcos was sitting in his small office, silently reviewing the financial reports of Valeria's family business. The silence in the room was only broken by the sound of the mouse as he navigated through the accounts. His mind was absorbed in numbers and opportunities, visualizing how all that money, all those investments, could be his someday. A slight smile of satisfaction appeared on his face. Valeria trusted him blindly, and that made him feel invincible. Outside, the afternoon was slowly fading, and the sunlight streaming through the window tinted the room in golden hues. Valeria, in the other room, was getting ready for the dinner they would have that night with her family. Everything seemed perfect from the outside, a solid relationship, future plans, and enviable stability. But Marcos wasn't interested in stability. He wanted power. He wanted it all. Valeria entered the room, looking at him with an affectionate smile. "Are you ready for tonight?" "My parents are excited to see you," she said as she finished putting on her earrings. Marcos looked up and feigned a smile, though his mind remained focused on his own plan. "Yes, of course. I'm looking forward to seeing them," he replied with a calm voice, but his attention was far from the family gathering. Valeria's family business had been his target since he met her. At first, he saw her as merely an opportunity to climb socially, but over time, his ambition grew beyond what he had imagined. Valeria, unaware of Marcos's thoughts, sat on the edge of the bed and caressed his face. "You don't know how lucky I feel to have found you. With you, everything seems easier," she confessed sweetly. Marcos looked into her eyes, feeling a momentary pang of guilt. He knew Valeria loved him sincerely, but for him, love had been relegated to the background. "I'm lucky too," he murmured, diverting his gaze to the computer screen, trying to drown out the little voice of conscience beginning to surface in his mind. Later that night, at dinner with Valeria's family, her father, Mr. Damian, spoke proudly about the business expansion and how, when the time came, Valeria would take over a large part of the family business. But of course, there will always be room for Marcos to get involved as well, Damian added, casting an approving look in his direction. Marcos felt the warmth of opportunity envelop him. "I've always wanted to be more involved, sir," he replied with a calculated smile. He knew that gaining the trust of Valeria's father was key to his plan. During the conversation, Marcos shot a subtle glance at Juan, a friend from his social circle who was also at the dinner. Juan, aware of Marcos's dark intentions, returned a knowing look. After all, he had been the one to plant the seed of betrayal in Marcos's mind months earlier. At the end of the dinner, as everyone sipped coffee and laughed at family stories, Marcos and Juan stepped a little away from the group. "So, old Damian is willing to let you get involved in the business?" Juan said in a low voice, approaching Marcos with a cynical smile. "He's practically handing me the keys to the kingdom," Marcos replied, savoring the power he felt on the verge of obtaining. But there was a hint of doubt in his voice, something Juan noticed immediately. "You know what you have to do. The time to act is approaching. You can't hesitate," Juan hinted, patting him on the back. "You have everything you need. Only the final blow remains," he added before returning to the others. Marcos nodded in silence, knowing Juan was right. The plan was underway, but something was still holding him back. Valeria. She was his only weakness, the only reason he sometimes hesitated to carry his plans to the end. But his ambition, that unstoppable force driving him forward, was much stronger than any remorse. When they returned home that night, Valeria lay down on the couch, exhausted but happy. "It was a perfect evening, wasn't it?" she said with a smile as she turned on a lamp. Marcos watched her in silence, his thoughts spinning rapidly. "Yes, it was perfect," he replied, looking at the engagement ring on Valeria's finger. He knew that time was ticking and that soon he would have to decide how far he was willing to go for his ambition. Valeria looked at him and, for a moment, seemed to sense something in his eyes, a coldness she had never seen before. "Are you okay?" "Love?" she asked with a hint of concern. Marcos approached, kissed her on the forehead, and replied, "Of course, I'm just thinking about our future." But the future he envisioned was not the one she expected. As Valeria fell asleep, Marcos stayed awake, looking out the window. His mind continued weaving the web of lies that would soon trap him and everyone around him. The sunlight filtered through the bedroom curtains as Valeria slowly woke up. She looked to her side and found Marcos sitting on the edge of the bed, absorbed in his own world. He held a phone in one hand and an envelope in the other. Valeria observed him curiously before speaking. "Are you okay?" "You look worried," she commented, her voice soft but filled with tenderness. Marcos barely heard her, lost in thoughts of his growing ambition. The envelope in his hand contained the documents Juan had obtained for him. They were financial reports from the company, but also a proposal for the first move he should make to control more parts of the business. Marcos nodded without looking at her and responded in a vague tone. "I was just thinking about what your father said last night. He really seems to trust me to help with the company." It was the truth, but the way Marcos planned to help was far from what Valeria or her family imagined. Valeria smiled and sat up in bed, stretching her arms. "It's because he sees how talented you are. I know that together we can achieve great things." In her mind, Valeria envisioned a shared future, a partnership where they both built a life based on love and trust. But in Marcos's mind, that vision became more distorted with each passing day. That afternoon, Marcos left home under the pretense of a meeting, but instead of heading to work, he went to meet Juan at an exclusive restaurant in the city. Juan was already waiting at a secluded table, a look of satisfaction on his face. "So, are you ready for the next step?" Juan asked as he took a sip of his drink, looking at Marcos with a calculated smile. Marcos nodded, but his thoughts were still clouded by a faint sense of guilt he couldn't shake. "What you're proposing is a risky move, Juan. We're talking about manipulating the family's investments. If something goes wrong, it's not just me who'll lose. I'd ruin Valeria and her family." His voice sounded fearful, but there was also a glimmer in his eyes that betrayed his interest in what Juan had presented. Juan leaned in, lowering his voice. "You're not seeing the big picture, Marcos. With this first move, you'll have control over dormant assets. If you play your cards right, you could multiply the fortune. Valeria doesn't need to know the details. She'll just see the results, and trust me, she'll thank you later." Marcos knew Juan was right. Valeria admired him, but deep down, he had always wanted to prove he could do more for himself, beyond their relationship. Yet, the guilt lingered, casting a shadow over his ambition. When he arrived home that evening, Valeria was preparing a special dinner. The small house they lived in was filled with warm, comforting aromas, a perfect contrast to the cold decisions Marcos had made that day. "How was your day?" Valeria asked as she chopped vegetables in the kitchen. Marcos watched her for a moment, almost unable to respond honestly. The image of Valeria, always kind and trusting, made him doubt what he was doing. But greed quickly smothered any doubts. "Good, it was a productive day," he replied as he set his briefcase down by the door and approached her. He kissed her gently on the forehead, a gesture that seemed full of love but was empty of sincerity inside. That night, as they ate dinner together, Valeria began telling him about her family's plans to expand the company. She explained how her father had thought about delegating more responsibilities and, to Marcos's surprise, mentioned that her father wanted him to take on a more important role. "My father thinks you should lead some of the new investments. He has a lot of faith in you, Marcos. He says he sees great potential in you," Valeria said with a proud smile. Marcos could hardly believe what he was hearing. However, he kept his composure and nodded, masking his inner excitement. "That's a great honor. I'll do everything I can to not let him down." That same night, after Valeria fell asleep, Marcos quietly got out of bed and went to his laptop. He opened the files Juan had sent him, details about the investments and financial maneuvers he could manipulate to increase his control. He spent hours reviewing them, his mind completely absorbed by the opportunity in front of him. The internal conflict was still there, but it weakened with each thought of the wealth and power he could gain. The next day, Valeria noticed that Marcos was more distracted than usual. "Is something wrong?" "You've been acting strange since last night," she remarked as they had breakfast. Marcos looked at her for a moment, searching for the right words. "No, I'm just thinking about everything your father mentioned about the investments. It's a big responsibility." Valeria looked at him with a gentle expression. "I know, but I trust you. My father does too. You've always been brilliant at everything you set your mind to." Valeria's words made him feel momentarily vulnerable. He knew she saw him as someone trustworthy, but he had already crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Later, Marcos went to meet with Juan to discuss the plan details. He knew that if he went forward, there would be no turning back. Juan greeted him with the same carefree attitude as always, but there was a seriousness in his tone when he said, "Today is the day, Marcos. If you do it right, everything you've ever wanted will be within reach. You just have to make that decision." Marcos knew he was about to dive into something dangerous. However, ambition pushed him forward. "I'm ready," he finally responded. Juan nodded with a smile. "Perfect. Now, let's make this work." Both leaned over the documents they had prepared, sealing Marcos's future in a plan that could not only make him rich, but also destroy everything he once loved. That night, as Valeria slept beside him, Marcos realized that there was no going back. The sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains of Marcos's office, but his mind was in a dark place. He had spent weeks immersed in financial moves, carefully manipulating Valeria's family investments, guided by Juan's promises. He knew he was playing with fire, but the temptation to keep the fortune was stronger than his morals. Marcos was seated at his desk, reviewing the latest reports he had received. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Every move he made brought him one step closer to controlling the family business. However, a shadow of worry lingered in his thoughts. Valeria continued to trust him blindly, and each day, his behavior became more erratic in her presence. Valeria watched him from the doorway, concerned about the growing distance between them. "Have you been very busy lately, Marcos?" "We barely talk like we used to," she said softly as she entered the office. Marcos looked up from the documents and forced a smile. "It's just work. With everything your father has entrusted to me, I want to make sure everything is in order." Valeria approached and put a hand on his shoulder, an expression of love and concern on her face. "You know I don't care that much about money, Marcos. I want you to be okay. I feel like you're drifting away from me." Marcos felt a pang of guilt, but quickly suppressed it. He knew he couldn't afford to doubt now. "Don't worry. Everything will be fine," he said, though the coldness in his voice was evident. That afternoon, Marcos met with Juan at an upscale restaurant in the city center. Both knew they were close to the decisive moment. "The merger is ready, Marcos. Once you sign these documents, you'll have full control of the family's investments. Valeria won't suspect a thing. All you need to do is follow the plan," Juan explained with a calculated smile. Despite his nerves, Marcos signed the papers. He felt power was within his grasp, but with each signature, the distance between him and Valeria grew even more. He knew he couldn't hide this forever, but his ambition blinded him to the consequences. That night, when he returned home, Valeria awaited him with a special dinner. She had lit candles and played his favorite music. "I want us to have some time for ourselves. I feel like we've been distant, and I want to reconnect," she said as she invited him to sit at the table. Marcos, surprised by the gesture, felt cornered. He knew that Valeria sincerely loved him, and every day, he had more of his true nature from her. As they dined, Valeria looked into his eyes, searching for a sign of the closeness they once shared. "Do you remember when we first started dating?" Valeria asked with a nostalgic smile. "You used to surprise me with little gestures. I loved how attentive you were." Marcos tried to smile, but his mind was elsewhere. "Of course, I remember," he said, but the words felt hollow. He knew that the man Valeria described no longer existed. He had become someone else, someone consumed by greed. After dinner, Valeria hugged him, but Marcos felt distant, as if an invisible barrier separated them. I feel like something has changed between us, Marcos. Are you sure everything's okay? Marcos gently pulled away and nodded. Everything's fine. I just need to rest. The excuse sounded weak, even to him, but Valeria didn't press further. That same night, while Valeria slept, Marcos went to his study and rechecked the documents he had signed with Juan. He knew he was about to cross a line of no return, but he was convinced that if everything went as he expected, Valeria would never find out. The next morning, Marcos went to the company to finalize the last details of the merger. Everything seemed to be in order, but as he reviewed the contracts, something made him stop. Juan had inserted a clause that gave him more control than he had mentioned. Marcos looked at him, feeling betrayed. "What's this, Juan?" "I thought we were going to split the profits fairly," he said in an accusatory tone. Juan smiled cynically. "This is part of the business, Marcos. You know how this world works. If you're not the one controlling, you're the one losing." "I thought you understood that." Marcos felt a surge of anger, but he was too deep into the plan to back out. "I'm going to keep what's mine, Juan. I won't let you push me out of the game." Juan looked at him with a defiant gaze. "Don't worry, Marcos. This is just a small adjustment. You're still earning much more than you had before." Marcos knew he was trapped. He couldn't back out without Valeria discovering what he had done, and he couldn't move forward without trusting someone like Juan, who was clearly willing to betray him at any moment. Back at home, Marcos realized that his relationship with Valeria had reached a critical point. Her worried looks were becoming more frequent, and her questions more insistent. But he continued hiding everything, convinced that soon he would have full control and that Valeria would never find out. That night, as Valeria slept beside him, Marcos realized something that would haunt him in the days to come. He was not only betraying Valeria, but also himself. But for him, it was too late to stop. The next day, Marcos was in his office, staring at the computer screen with a mix of anxiety and frustration. The numbers in Valeria's accounts were beginning to show unusual movements, and Marcos knew that one was playing his own game. He couldn't let his plan fall apart now, when he was so close to securing the fortune. While trying to stay calm, Valeria entered the office with a sweet, tired smile. "Have you taken a break today?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. Marcos looked up and forced a smile. "I'm just checking on some work stuff." "Nothing serious," he replied, in a tone trying to sound casual. Valeria walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Lately, I feel like you're worrying about a lot of things. If you need to talk, you know I'm here," she said with warmth that made him feel even more guilty. Marcos nodded, not looking at her directly. He knew his plan was moving forward, but the emotional cost was starting to get too high. He had lost the connection with Valeria, but he couldn't turn back. "I'm fine, really," he said, gently brushing her hand off his shoulder. Valeria watched him silently for a few seconds, trying to figure out what was going through Marcos's mind. But instead of pressing, she left the office. "I'll let you work. Don't worry about me," she said before exiting, closing the door behind her. Marcos let out a sigh of relief, but also one of growing despair. He knew he was trapped in a snare of his own making. Juan, on the other hand, was still pulling the strings of the merger, and every time Marcos tried to intervene, Juan grew more firm in his control. That same afternoon, Marcos decided to confront Juan. He couldn't let things get any more out of hand. He found him at the restaurant where they usually met. Juan was waiting for him with his usual cynical smile, sipping a glass of wine. "I thought you had already accepted the terms," Juan remarked as he raised his glass. "I didn't expect to see you so tense." Marcos sat down across from him and fixed his gaze on his partner. "I want to make some changes to the deal. I don't like how you're handling things. You know this isn't what we planned." Juan chuckled quietly, leaning toward him. "Do you really think you can change the rules of the game now? You already signed, Marcos. You're in, and backing out now would cost you more than you're willing to pay." Marcos's heart raced, but he tried to remain calm. "I'm not going to let you take more than what's yours. Valeria trusted me, and if she finds out what we've done..." Juan interrupted him, raising an eyebrow. "Valeria won't find out anything. And even if she did, do you think she'd forgive you? You've crossed too many lines, my friend. There's no going back." The truth in Juan's words hit him hard. Marcos knew he had crossed the point of no return, but the feeling of losing control was eating him up. His ambition had blinded him, and now he was under the thumb of someone much more clever. That night, as he drove home, Juan's words echoed in his mind. He knew he couldn't keep going like this. He was losing Valeria, his dignity, and what had once been his morals. But at the same time, he couldn't see a clear way out. When he arrived home, he found Valeria in the living room, reading a book. The warmth of the home, the scent of freshly brewed coffee, everything that had surrounded him for years felt like a reminder of what he was losing. Valeria looked up when he entered, her gaze showing concern, but also unconditional love. "Marcos, can we talk?" she asked calmly. He nodded, sitting down across from her. He knew this conversation was inevitable. "What's going on, Valeria?" She watched him silently for a few moments before speaking. "I've noticed you've been more distant. Not just with work, but with me. I don't feel like you're really here anymore, and it hurts. If something's bothering you, I want you to tell me." Marcos felt the lump in his throat, but he couldn't reveal the truth. "It's just work stress, nothing more," he lied, knowing Valeria deserved something better than that. She looked at him sadly, as if she knew there was more behind his words. "Marcos, I don't want to lose you. It doesn't matter about the money or the company, I just want us to be okay." The weight of her words overwhelmed him. Valeria was his light, and he was betraying her in the worst way. But even then, he couldn't stop. "You're not going to lose me," he assured her, though in his heart, he knew he already had. Days went by, and Marcos continued his double life. Valeria kept supporting him, but the shadow of guilt followed him everywhere. Every time one called, Marcos felt the control slipping further from his hands. He couldn't abandon the plan, and he couldn't tell Valeria the truth. One day, Valeria announced that her father had decided to transfer a significant share of the family company to her. "I want us both to be more involved," she said with a sincere smile, unaware of Marcos's true intentions. The news was an unexpected blow. With this new responsibility, Valeria would be more involved in the financial decisions. If she noticed what was going on with the accounts, his whole plan would fall apart. Marcos felt like he was walking a tightrope. That night, while Valeria slept beside him, Marcos couldn't sleep. Guilt, betrayal, and fear tormented him. He knew the day was coming when he would have to face the consequences of his actions, but until then, he would keep moving the pieces in his dangerous game. Fate seemed to be playing against him, and the clock ticked relentlessly toward an inevitable end. Marcos could only hope that, when everything was revealed, there would still be something worth fighting for. But deep down, he feared he had already lost everything. Hours later, Marcos was in the company's conference room, watching as the shareholders discussed the new direction the company should take. Since Valeria had taken on more responsibility in the family business, the decision seemed more aligned with her values of transparency and ethics. This, of course, was a hindrance to Marcos and Juan's plans. Every move he made to divert funds or control the company's stock was becoming more difficult. The clock in the conference room struck 5 p.m. when Valeria walked in. She looked tired, but her smile lit up the room. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sitting down next to Marcos. "I've had back-to-back meetings all day, but we need to make sure this project moves forward." Marcos, pretending to be interested, nodded. "Of course, darling. This is the most important thing right now," he replied, subtly avoiding eye contact. He knew soon someone, perhaps Valeria, would start asking questions. Valeria glanced at the documents on the table. "Marcos, I've been reviewing the finances more carefully lately," she said casually, but with firmness. "It looks like there are some discrepancies. I want to make sure everything is in order before we move forward with the next steps." Marcos's heart raced, though he tried to stay calm. "Discrepancies? What do you mean?" he asked, feeling his throat dry up. Valeria looked at him directly, with a mix of concern and curiosity. "It's just small details, but I'm not sure all the transfers are properly justified. Maybe we can go over them together." Marcos knew he had to be careful. "Don't worry, it's probably just a mistake. I'll take care of it," he said, trying to divert the attention. But Valeria didn't seem convinced. I think it's important we look at this together. I want to be sure everything's in order, she insisted. The conversation was interrupted by a call from Juan, who asked Marcos to meet with him immediately. Marcos took the opportunity to leave the room. We'll talk later, Valeria. I need to take this call, he said hurriedly. When he arrived at Juan's office, the tension was palpable. Juan sat behind his desk with an expression that mixed disdain and frustration. What do you think you're doing? Juan asked sternly. Marcos dropped into the chair across from him. Valeria is starting to investigate. She's going over the accounts, Juan. If we don't act fast, she'll figure everything out. Juan scoffed with contempt. That's not my problem. You're the one who brought her into this, not me. You should have been smarter and kept her out of it. Marcos clenched his fists, knowing that Juan wouldn't take responsibility if things went wrong. I need more time. If Valeria keeps investigating, everything will fall apart. We need to divert her attention before it's too late. Juan stared at him. You're asking for too much, Marcos. You knew what you were getting into from the start. This isn't a game. And you think I don't know that? Marcos responded, raising his voice. I'm losing control. If we don't do something, she'll find out everything, and then what? Are you going to wash your hands of it and leave me to deal with the consequences? Juan smiled coldly. You're in this for your ambition, my friend. Don't forget that. If you lose, it's your problem. Back at home, Valeria felt increasingly uncomfortable. She had noticed changes in Marcos for some time, but she couldn't figure out exactly what was going on. That night, while they were having dinner, Valeria tried to bring the subject up again. Marcos, I really want to talk about what I found in the accounts. We can't just let this go. Marcos, feeling cornered, tried to calm her down. Valeria, I told you before. I'll take care of it. There's nothing to worry about. But Valeria wasn't willing to let it go. It's not just that, Marcos. I feel like there's something more, something you're not telling me. What's going on between us? Marcos looked away, unable to face her. He knew his lie was about to be uncovered, and he had no way to stop it. The pressure was consuming him, and Juan's constant presence only complicated things further. You're imagining things, Valeria. Everything's fine, he said, though even he knew it sounded false. Valeria, visibly hurt, didn't press any further. But she knew something was very wrong. She decided to investigate on her own and, the next day, contacted an external auditor to review the company's accounts. Meanwhile, Marcos was spiraling into desperation. Juan wasn't willing to help him, and Valeria was getting closer and closer to the truth. He knew that if she got her hands on the manipulated bank accounts, everything would be over. A few days later, Marcos received an urgent call from Valeria. Her tone was serious, almost cold. We need to talk. Right now, she said. Marcos felt a chill run down his spine. What's this about? He asked, though he already knew the answer. You'll see when you get here. I'm at the office, Valeria replied before hanging up. When he arrived at the office, Valeria was waiting for him with several papers in her hand. Her expression was grim. I've been going over everything, she said, showing him the documents. There's something very wrong with these accounts, Marcos. I need you to explain what's going on. Marcos felt the ground beneath him crumble. Valeria, I can explain, he stammered. Really? She replied, looking at him with disbelief. Because what I see here doesn't make sense. This is fraud, Marcos. Fraud against our company. Marcos didn't know what to say. The words escaped him as Valeria looked at him with eyes full of disappointment. I thought we were a team. Why did you do this? How could you betray me like this? She asked, tears welling in her eyes. Marcos tried to approach her, but Valeria took a step back. Don't come near me, she said firmly. I can't trust you anymore. The silence between them was deafening. Marcos, faced with the reality of his actions, understood that his ambition had led him to the edge of a cliff, and now he was losing everything. I'm going to report this, Marcos, Valeria said, her voice shaking. I'll make sure you pay for this. Marcos, defeated and with no way out, had no choice but to accept his fate. Marcos was sitting in his apartment, surrounded by the papers he once controlled with such ease, but now they seemed like proof of his downfall. Valeria's call, that last warning, echoed in his head like an endless echo. The betrayal he had committed, not only to his partner but to himself, was crushing him. His unchecked ambition had led him to the edge of the cliff, and there was no turning back. From the window, he watched the city lights flicker, an irony compared to the darkness he felt inside. He knew the police, auditors, and lawyers were already after him. He had lost everything, but what hurt the most was that he had lost Valeria, the only person who had truly believed in him. At that moment, his phone rang. It was Juan. The voice of his former accomplice sounded cold and distant. "How are you handling all of this, Marcos?" he asked with a slight irony. Marcos gritted his teeth. "You know exactly how I am, Juan. I don't need you to remind me." Juan let out a dry laugh. "You knew this could happen. I warned you not to get carried away by your emotions, but you always wanted more, always more. You also convinced me that we could handle it, that everything would be under control." Marcos shouted, his frustration finally overflowing. "And it was under control. Until you fell in love with the rich girl. I told you it wasn't personal, but you. Well, you made everything personal. Now look where you are," Juan replied, his coldness freezing Marcos's blood. "And you? Are you going to wash your hands and let them sink me alone?" Marcos asked, feeling panic take hold of him. "I'm always prepared for the worst. That's the difference between you and me. If you go down, it will be because of your own weight, not because of anything I did," Juan replied before abruptly hanging up. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcos knew he was alone. Without Valeria, without allies, and now without his wealth. Hours later, Valeria walked down the hallway of her office with a determined look on her face. She had called an emergency meeting with the board members. Marcos had left a deep scar on the company and on her personal life, but she would not allow that wound to destroy everything she had built. She had a plan. When she entered the meeting room, the board members were already seated, watching her expectantly. Among them was Alejandro, her trusted lawyer, who nodded at her, indicating that everything was ready. Valeria took a deep breath before speaking. "I called this meeting to discuss the recent findings in our finances," she said firmly. "As you all know, we have found serious irregularities in the accounts, and everything points to Marcos having diverted funds." A murmur spread through the room, but Valeria raised her hand for silence. "I know this is a shock to everyone, especially to me. But my priority is the company and protecting what my family built. I have already initiated legal proceedings for Marcos to be formally investigated." Alejandro spoke up at that moment. "We are preparing a civil and criminal lawsuit against Marcos. The evidence we have is overwhelming. We will make sure he pays for what he did." The board members nodded, though some appeared concerned about the public repercussions of the scandal. Valeria, however, had already made her decision. She had been hurt by Marcos's betrayal, but she would not let the company fall with him. After the meeting, Valeria sat in her office, exhausted. Alejandro entered and closed the door behind him. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" he asked, looking at her with concern. Valeria nodded. "I can't let this go unpunished, Alejandro. Marcos didn't just betray me, he betrayed the entire company. He must pay for it." Alejandro looked at her for a moment before nodding. "I understand. I just wanted to make sure you're not letting your emotions get the best of you." Valeria smiled bitterly. "Emotions no longer have a place here. Not after everything that happened." Days later, as the investigation advanced, Marcos found himself increasingly cornered. The media began to publish details of the fraud, and his reputation was crumbling by the second. His lawyer, a serious and unscrupulous man, made it clear that things didn't look good. "If you plead guilty, we could negotiate a settlement, but if you keep denying it, you could face a harsher sentence." Marcos, who once felt invincible, was now desperate. "I can't fall like this," he murmured, more to himself than to his lawyer. "You should have thought about that earlier," the lawyer responded, showing no compassion. That night, Marcos returned to his apartment, a place that had once symbolized his success, but now felt like a prison. He opened a bottle of whiskey and collapsed on the sofa, staring at the ceiling as the city lights flickered through the windows. In his mind, he replayed every decision that had led him to this point. His unchecked ambition, his desire to control everything around him, his betrayal of Valeria. Everything blended together in a whirlwind of regret and self-loathing. He knew that, somehow, he had dug his own grave, and now there was nothing left but to wait for the inevitable final blow. But while Marcos drowned in his despair, Valeria, on the other hand, began to rebuild her life. Although Marcos's betrayal had left her devastated, she knew she couldn't stay stuck in the past. With the support of Alejandro and her team, she began to restructure the company and clean up the mess Marcos had left behind. Inside, Valeria no longer felt the anger that had dominated her days after discovering the truth. She had accepted that Marcos, blinded by ambition, had made decisions that destroyed him. But she would not let hate consume her. Now, her priority was the future, a future without him. The chapter ended with Valeria looking at the horizon from the terrace of her house, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. She knew there was much to rebuild, but she also knew that she was stronger than she had ever believed. Meanwhile, Marcos, alone in his apartment, realized that the ambition that had driven him to betray Valeria was the same one that had now destroyed him. Marcos was sitting in front of his computer, reading the latest news about the legal proceedings against him. The screen glowed before his eyes, displaying headlines that pointed to him as the perpetrator of one of the largest frauds in the city's recent history. His name was on everyone's lips, and not for the reasons he had imagined when he planned to seize Valeria's fortune. The phone rang, and Marcos looked at it with indifference. He knew it wasn't good news, but he picked it up anyway. "Mr. Marcos, this is your lawyer," said the voice on the other end of the line, in a serious tone. "I don't want to drag this out any longer than necessary. The prosecutor has rejected any settlement offer. They have solid evidence, and they intend to go to trial without hesitation." Marcos gritted his teeth, feeling a wave of anxiety rise from his chest. "What are you telling me?" He responded in a sharp tone, trying to stay calm. "There's no way out?" "Exactly that. The best you can do now is prepare for the worst. If the trial goes forward, you could be facing a sentence of many years, with no chance for a reduction." The conversation ended abruptly. Marcos threw the phone onto the table, frustrated, feeling the weight of his decisions crushing him. Everything he had done, the betrayal of Valeria, the greed that had led him to destroy his relationship and now his reputation, seemed like an unbreakable chain pulling him deeper and deeper into the abyss. Meanwhile, Valeria moved on with her life. The legal proceedings against Marcos had freed her from the emotional burden he had left in her life. With the help of Alejandro, her lawyer and close friend, she had rebuilt the company and stabilized her personal life. However, there was still a part of her that felt residual pain from the betrayal of someone she had once trusted. One day, while Valeria was walking through the offices of her company, Alejandro approached her with a serious look on his face. "Valeria, we need to talk," he said, pointing to the empty meeting room. Inside, the tension between them was palpable. Alejandro placed a series of documents on the table and pushed them toward her. "This is the latest offer presented by Marcos's lawyers," he explained, as Valeria picked up the papers. "They're trying to find a solution to reduce his sentence, but the only way is if you're willing to drop some charges." Valeria looked at him, surprised by the proposal. The idea that Marcos, after everything he had done to her, was now seeking emotional salvation from her made her stomach turn. But as she read the documents, an internal struggle began in her mind. Valeria was not naturally cruel, but the idea of forgiving Marcos seemed almost impossible. "What are you thinking of doing?" asked Alejandro, trying to read her emotions. Valeria sighed deeply, pushing the papers out of her view. She didn't know what to do. Justice was on her side, but something inside her resisted simply condemning him without more. Later that evening, Valeria sat on the balcony of her house, gazing at the city lights under the starry sky. She reflected on everything that had happened. The love she had once felt for Marcos, the way he had betrayed her for his greed. She remembered how, Deep down, she had thought he was someone she could build a life with, but that illusion had shattered. In the midst of her thoughts, she received an unexpected call. It was Marcos. "Valeria, please listen to me," he said, his voice hoarse and full of regret. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, nor your compassion, but I beg you, don't let me fall into this endless hole. Everything I did was wrong, I know, but I've lost everything. I have no one else but you to save me." Valeria closed her eyes, feeling a mix of emotions rush over her. It wasn't just Marcos's voice that disturbed her, but the honesty with which he spoke. He sounded defeated, a man who had nothing left to lose. But at the same time, that same honesty made her wonder if he had really changed or if he was still the same man who had betrayed her. "I don't know what you want from me, Marcos," she responded, her voice controlled. "There's nothing I can do to make things go back to the way they were. What you did broke me, and not just me, but also the company, everyone who trusted you." I know, Marcos interrupted, desperate. "But I can't face this alone. I swear I regret it. Every second that passes, I regret it more. Give me a chance to redeem myself." Valeria, holding the phone, thought about doing what was right, not just for her, but also for Marcos. She knew she had the power to destroy him completely, but was that really what she wanted? Deep down, though it pained her to admit it, she wanted to close this chapter of her life with peace, not with more revenge. "Marcos," she said finally, in a cold but firm tone, "I don't hate you. But I can't save you. The only thing I can do is not drag you down further than you already are. I don't promise anything, but I'll think about what you asked." And she hung up, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. That was the last trace of compassion she had left for him. Marcos, for his part, was left alone in his dark apartment, knowing that forgiveness was not in his hands. Valeria decided that the next step would not depend on what Marcos could offer her, but on what she needed to move forward with her life. Hours later, Valeria found herself in her office, surrounded by documents, but her mind was far from work. Marcos's call still echoed in her head. The plea in his voice, the regret that sounded real, had left her unsettled. No matter how much she tried to ignore it, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to make a final decision about her future and Marcos's. Valeria had managed to stabilize her company, despite the chaos that Marcos had left after his betrayal. Thanks to Alejandro and his team, she had closed several important deals and maintained the trust of her investors. However, despite her professional success, there was a constant shadow in her life, the need to decide what to do with Marcos. While Valeria tried to focus on a financial report, Alejandro entered her office. He had always been an unwavering support, and at that moment, she could see the worry on his face. "Are you still thinking about him?" Alejandro asked, his tone soft but direct. Valeria sighed, leaving the pen on the table. "I can't help it," she responded. "It's like a thorn that won't go away. I feel like if I don't make a clear decision, I'll never be able to move on." "You know you owe him nothing," Alejandro said. "After everything he did, the only person you need to protect is yourself." "I know," Valeria said, lowering her gaze. "But I also don't want to carry more hatred. I've worked too hard to be where I am now. I don't want anger and resentment to define my life." That afternoon, Valeria went to see her therapist, something she had been doing regularly since the legal process against Marcos began. As she talked about the latest call from her ex, her therapist listened silently, allowing her to vent her emotions. "It seems like what really bothers you isn't Marcos, but what forgiving him means," the therapist said, with a warm smile. Valeria looked at her, a bit confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting what he did or letting him off the hook. Forgiveness is for you, so you can free yourself from the weight that's holding you back. You don't have to help him, you don't have to save him. You just have to decide how you want to live your life from now on." The words resonated in Valeria. It wasn't about Marcos or what he wanted from her. It was about how she wanted to close that chapter of her life. Back at her apartment, Valeria sat down at her computer and opened an email she hadn't read in days. It was from Marcos's lawyers, requesting a meeting to discuss the terms of her possible collaboration in the legal process. The cursor blinked on the screen, waiting for her response. Valeria made a clear and firm decision. She replied to the email, declining the meeting, but leaving a final door open, the possibility of forgiving him in her heart, without getting involved further. She knew she couldn't save Marcos from his mistakes, but she didn't have to keep carrying the weight of his actions. In that moment, Valeria felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time in months, she was in control of her life, her destiny. Alejandro called her that night. "So, what did you decide?" he asked with curiosity. "I let him go, Alejandro," Valeria responded with a smile. "I finally let him go." Days later, Valeria was walking through the city streets on a rainy afternoon. The raindrops slid down her umbrella as she watched people moving quickly, oblivious to their own thoughts. She had freed herself from the weight she carried with Marcos, but a sense of emptiness remained. She wondered if she had made the right decision. As she walked, her phone vibrated. It was Alejandro, who had been sending her messages frequently since her decision. She knew he had always been there to support her, but now, with Marcos no longer a constant presence in her life, something between them was beginning to change. "Is everything okay?" Alejandro asked on the other end of the line, with that calm tone that always made her feel safe. "Yes, I just needed to walk for a bit, clear my mind," Valeria replied, watching her reflection in a store window. "How about dinner?" he offered with an evident warmth. "I think we need to celebrate your freedom from all this chaos." Valeria smiled to herself. Alejandro had been her pillar these last few months, but there was something in his tone this time that sounded different, something more personal. "I'd love to," she said finally, feeling that a new door was opening before her. That evening, Alejandro and Valeria dined at a small restaurant, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. As they conversed, Valeria couldn't help but notice that something had changed between them. Alejandro, though he had always been affectionate and close, seemed more determined. Their gazes crossed in a different, more intense way. "You've been incredible throughout this process," Alejandro said, pouring her some wine. "Not many people could have dealt with what you've been through and come out stronger." Valeria nodded, grateful for his words, but knowing that the conversation was about to go deeper. "Alejandro, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me. Not just for the company, but for always being there," she said sincerely. "You don't need to thank me," he replied, looking her straight in the eye. "I did it because I love you, Valeria." The words hung in the air for a moment. Valeria felt her heart race, but at the same time, a peace within her that she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if she were finally seeing clearly what had been in front of her all this time. "I love you too," she admitted, letting out the words she had kept inside for so long. The confession completely changed the dynamic between them. In the following days, Valeria and Alejandro began spending more time together, not just as business partners or friends, but as something deeper. Alejandro accompanied her in her routines, helped her reorganize the company, and gradually, their feelings grew stronger. However, Valeria still felt that something was pending. Despite leaving Marcos behind, she knew she had to confront him one last time. Not for him, but for herself, to close that chapter once and for all. Alejandro accompanied her to the final meeting with Marcos. They had agreed to meet at a cafe near the lawyer's office. Marcos had been insisting on talking, and although Valeria didn't want to pick up anything with him again, she knew she needed to hear what he had to say. When Valeria arrived at the cafe, she saw Marcos sitting in a corner, his face visibly older and more worn. The months of legal battles and the loss of his fortune had transformed him into someone unrecognizable. "Valeria, thank you for coming," Marcos said with a subdued voice. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I needed to apologize." Valeria listened in silence as he spoke of his regrets. For the first time, Marcos seemed genuine in his remorse. "I can't change what I did," he continued. "But I needed you to know that I'm sorry. I lost everything because of my greed, and now I understand what truly matters. Valeria nodded slowly. Although Marcos's words couldn't erase the harm he had done, something inside her began to heal at that moment. She didn't need his forgiveness to move forward, but this encounter allowed her to finally close that chapter in her life. I hope you find your way, Marcos, she said calmly. I've already found mine. When Valeria left the cafe, she felt that the chapter of her life with Marcos had finally closed. Outside, Alejandro was waiting for her with a warm smile. It was the beginning of something new, something that had risen from the ashes of a painful past. Weeks later, Valeria woke up early one morning, the sunlight gently streaming through the curtains of her bedroom, illuminating the new day. Alejandro slept peacefully beside her. After months of uncertainty and pain, she felt that her life had finally found a balance. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a small routine they had both adopted together since their lives began intertwining. She carefully got up to avoid waking him, put on a light robe, and headed to the kitchen. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. Somehow, everything she had lost had turned into something better. She still carried the scars of Marcos's betrayal in her heart, but those wounds were now part of her story, not her present. At that moment, Alejandro appeared in the kitchen, still with a sleepy expression, but with a calm smile. Up so early, he said in a relaxed tone, approaching to kiss her on the forehead. Sometimes I can't help it, she replied, smiling. I like to enjoy this moment of peace before the world starts spinning again. Alejandro watched her in silence for a moment, knowing that these peaceful moments were what Valeria valued most after the whirlwind she had been through. Since her relationship with Marcos had ended, everything had changed. However, the biggest change wasn't just the breakup, but the fact that Valeria had finally found something more valuable than material wealth, the peace that comes from living an authentic life. That afternoon, while Valeria and Alejandro were reviewing some plans for the future of the company, they received unexpected news. Marcos had decided to sell all his properties and move abroad. The last piece of that painful chapter was finally moving away from their lives. Alejandro, noticing the expression on Valeria's face, asked, "Are you okay?" Valeria sighed deeply and then nodded. "Yeah, I'm just surprised at how quickly everything changed. A year ago, I was battling an emotional storm, and now it's like everything has been left behind in a way I never imagined." Alejandro looked at her warmly. "Sometimes, time is all we need to heal. And you've shown that you're stronger than you thought." "You've been an important part of that," she replied, taking his hand with gratitude. Time passed, and Valeria and Alejandro decided to leave the house they shared, the one that still held too many memories of the past with Marcos. They both felt they needed a true new beginning, a place where there were no shadows of what was, but light for what would come. They moved into a smaller house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by nature and tranquility. The move represented more than just a physical change. It was a symbol of everything they had both left behind to build a new, shared life. One evening, as Alejandro and Valeria looked at the starry sky from the garden, Alejandro gently took her hand. "We've been through so much," he said. "But I think this is just the beginning of everything we can build together." Valeria looked at him with a sincere smile. She knew he was right. They had faced lies, betrayals, and deep wounds, but what emerged from all that chaos was something stronger, something that didn't depend on what they had lost, but on what they had built together. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," she replied, squeezing his hand tightly. The wind blew softly, and that night, surrounded by peace, Valeria and Alejandro understood that it didn't matter what the past had been. They had found the path to forgiveness, healing, and true love. And most importantly, they had learned to look forward, without letting the shadows of others' greed and ambition define their lives. In the end, Valeria realized that true wealth wasn't in material possessions, nor in the money that once surrounded her. True wealth was in the connections built on respect, trust, and genuine love. Instead of holding on to what she had lost, she decided to embrace what she had gained, a new life with Alejandro, free from the ghosts of the past. The story ends with both of them looking towards the future, knowing that the most important things are those that can't be bought or sold: inner peace and shared love. This story invites reflection on the value of second chances and how sometimes what seems like a loss can be a blessing in disguise. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to share in the comments what you felt after hearing it, and if you've been through a similar situation of betrayal, I'd love to hear your valuable opinion. I would be honored if you leave a like, share the video with a friend or family member, and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next surprising story appearing on your screen right now. We have guaranteed entertainment exclusively for you. See you in the next video.